I'm So Tired of Masking by Haven's Here Again. A Batman All Media Types and Red Robin fanfic rated for general audiences. Tagged for the relationship Tim Drake and Jason Todd, with additional tags for Autistic Tim Drake, CEO Tim Drake needs a hug, Tim Drake gets a hug, Emotional Hurt Comfort, Meltdown, Autistic Meltdown, Some Internalized Ableism, Self-Hate in the Form of Scratching, Masking, Autistic Masking, Relationship Reveal, kind of, Established Relationship, Good Sibling Cassandra Cain, Protective Cassandra Cain, Protective Jason Todd, Title from Not Yet Titled by Im Ha Hee, No Beta, We Die Like Jack and Janet Drake. Summary. Tim has a rough day at the Manor. Tim had known since he woke up that it was going to be a bad day. He hadn't gotten to sleep until 8 a.m., because after patrol, he'd been looking into a case Bruce had asked for his help with. With it being Saturday, he planned to just sleep most of the day, then get back to casework and any urgent WE tasks in the evening before patrol. That plan went down the drain when Steph broke into his apartment just before noon, insisting that he come to the Manor for brunch with everyone. She refused to take no for an answer, so he dragged himself out of bed and threw on comfortable clothes. He debated wearing a jacket of Jason's he'd stolen, but didn't want to deal with any questions about it, since their relationship was still relatively new. Before leaving the nest, he grabbed an energy drink from the fridge, ignoring Steph's disapproving noise. He downed somewhere between a third and a half of the can before she started her car, already feeling an anxious energy building up in his chest. The energy drink would likely only make it worse, but he needed the caffeine to actually stay awake at the Manor. He sipped on the drink on the drive over, listening to Steph ramble on about her classes. Usually, he'd be a more active participant in the conversation, but he wasn't sure how much talking he'd be doing later. Better save the social energy. Once they pulled up in front of the Manor, he downed the last of his drink, leaving the can in Steph's car. He didn't feel like dealing with Bruce's disappointed look, or Alfred's disapproval. Barbara's car was in the driveway, but Tim cocked his head when he realized Dick's car wasn't there. Steph noticed and answered his unasked question. They sent him to get Jason. Tim winced a little, and Steph laughed. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be him either. Not quite what Tim had been thinking, but fair enough. The other bats didn't know just how close Tim and Jason had gotten after Tim's little world tour, especially the past few months, and he wasn't about to say anything. When they entered the Manor, Alfred herded them into the dining room, where everyone, save Dick and Jason, were sat at the table. Steph sat next to Babs, and Tim sat next to Cass. Everyone's greeting jarred him slightly, but he forced himself to smile and act as normal as he could. Cass, of course, could tell something was up, but waited until everyone was thoroughly distracted to say anything. Okay? She asked quietly. Tim sighed and sipped his water. Tired, he told her, turning to make eye contact. Cass was always able to read exactly how he felt, and, while with almost anyone else it felt invasive, with her eye contact was comforting. She always understood. Cass placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. I'll help if it's too much, she said, and Tim nodded gratefully. She knew how overwhelming the bats could be. At that moment, Dick burst into the dining room, yelling, Hey, look who I got! And Tim flinched back slightly. No one but Cass and Jason seemed to notice. Jason trailing Dick into the room, with an annoyed look on his face. He rolled his eyes and said, No need for the dramatics, dickhead, while moving to sit next to Tim. Dick was already heading for an empty chair between Babs and Damien. Tim could see the confusion on a few faces at Jason's seating choice, but no one said anything. While they didn't know exactly how close the two were, they did often team up on patrol and missions. We can finally eat! Steph yelled, just to be dramatic. Jason rolled his eyes again. Not like anyone told me about this little get-together, he joked, as everyone started passing around dishes. We talked about it on comms last night, Dick said, brows scrunched in confusion. Tim snorted. You think he pays attention to the comms? He asked. In truth, Tim hadn't heard it mentioned either, but it was probably because he changed to a different channel to get away from the chatter. Which Jason often did as well. Hey, you didn't know either, boy blunder, Steph said, pointing an accusing finger at him. Others began their own conversations around them. Tim rolled his eyes. Some of us have better things to pay attention to than you guys talking about your weekend plans, he told her. He could see a flash of emotion cross her face. But with how tired he was, it passed before he could parse it out. Put Saturday brunch in your calendar, Bruce called from the head of the table. Tim turned to look at him and cocked his head. We've been trying to make it a regular thing, but you and Jason never seem to come, so we sent Dick and Stephanie to get you. Tim looked at Jason, who simply shrugged. How long had they been trying to do this? And why not just say something directly rather than send people to their apartments? You could have just called, Tim argued, poking his eggs. He wasn't sure whether he'd be able to stomach them. Bruce looked sheepish at the mention of calling, and Tim sighed, leaning back in his chair. Of course Bruce wouldn't just call. Tim went quiet after that, simply trying to force himself to eat. Normally, he liked Alfred's scrambled eggs, but today he couldn't stand the texture. But they were on his plate, so he made himself eat them, even if his stomach clenched. He wasn't really taking part in the conversation around him, having trouble focusing on one at a time. After maybe 15 minutes, Jason bumped their shoulders together, getting Tim's attention. You all right? He asked quietly. Tim shook himself out of his head, glancing around the table. Steph was talking to Babs, while Duke, Damien, and Dick had some sort of argument. Cass was quietly eating and watching everyone, but she already knew about him and Jason, so he wasn't worried about her. And Bruce was looking at his phone. Bad day, he settled on. Jason would understand what he meant. He'd helped Tim with bad days like this before. You want to leave? Jason asked. Tim shook his head. Too many questions, he replied. If he tried to leave early, everyone would want to know what was up with him, and he didn't feel like explaining it all, and dealing with their pity, sympathy. Plus Steph had driven him. He'd need to either call an Uber or get a ride back from someone, neither of which he felt like doing. Jason nodded and murmured, You need to get away? You let me know. Tim offered him a small smile, before going back to his food. Jason engaged Cass in a conversation about her recent ballet classes. Tim was happy to listen in on that conversation. Thanks to their individual closeness with Tim, Jason and Cass had started growing closer, which made Tim incredibly happy. Two of his favorite people would now have movie nights together at his apartment, and listen to him info dump about anything. After another few minutes, everyone started cleaning up, carrying dishes to the kitchen, despite Alfred's protests. You want to head out? Cass asked quietly as they left the kitchen. Before Tim could respond, there was another arm thrown around his shoulders, and he had to hold back a flinch from the unexpected touch. Head out? Dick echoed, voice drawing the attention of the others. We haven't even played any games yet! Tim just gave Cass a look, knowing she'd understand. As much as Tim wanted to leave, everyone but her and Jason would kick up a fuss about it if he tried. Tim rolled his eyes and pushed Dick's arm off him. I'll stay a bit longer, but I've got some WE work to get done this afternoon, he said. It wasn't entirely a lie, but he was mostly planning to duck back to the nest and get some more sleep before patrol. Tim, you're the CEO, Steph argued, pushing between him and Cass. Surely you don't need to get it done today. Tim huffed. The board doesn't take me seriously enough as it is. The last thing I need is to give them more ammo. Again, not entirely true. The board might not have liked a 17-year-old becoming their majority shareholder and CEO, but in the months since then, Tim had proved himself, and they enjoyed the PR their teenage CEO brought in. He could easily come up with an excuse they'd be okay with if any of his work was late. He just didn't want to. It was better for him to stay on top of things, as much as he could. "Are they giving you trouble?" Bruce asked, turning from where he'd been heading to the sitting room while talking to Duke. Of course now Bruce was concerned. Tim shrugged. "No more than usual," he replied, then tacked on, "I'd like to keep it that way." Before anyone else could say anything about it, Jason stuck his head around the hall and cut in. "Can we get this show on the road? I came here to kick ass at Mario Kart, not listen to you all gossip and shit." Steph bounded forward with a scoff. "Yeah, right, zombie boy," she said. "Have you ever played on the Switch?" Tim could see as Jason went to argue, but he held his tongue. The two of them, and sometimes Cass, had played Mario Kart at the Nest, but apparently the others hadn't considered that. Did they really not notice Tim and Jason hanging out? Even if they weren't aware of them dating, they hadn't tried to hide the fact that they spent time together outside the field. Instead, Jason shrugged. "Can't be that different from the controls I remember." Dick had run ahead to set up the Joy-Cons, leaving Tim and Cass behind. Cass held his shoulder as Bruce walked into the sitting room, then quietly asked, "Are you sure?" Tim sighed and nodded. He really didn't feel like dealing with all the questions and pestering, if he tried to leave now, as on edge as he'd become. The nervous energy in his chest was building, and Cass was clearly aware of that, but neither of them had driven, so he didn't have an easy out. He took a moment to shake out his hands, which only marginally helped. "I only have to stay for a few games, right?" he asked, his voice weak. Cass looked sad, but nodded. She clearly wasn't happy Tim was pushing himself, but wasn't going to argue. Instead, she squeezed his shoulders and reassured him. "I'm here if you need. And Jason." Tim gave a small smile, and nodded. They'd both helped him with this sort of thing before. It was comforting to know that they had his back. With another reassuring squeeze, Cass let go and headed into the sitting room. Tim trailed after her. The others had the Switch set up, gathered around the TV. "We've got a rotation set up," Dick called to them. Tim didn't really feel like playing, but nodded anyway. Duke, Damien, Steph, and Jason held the Joy-Cons, already picking their characters and arguing over cups. Tim took a seat in the open armchair, Cass sitting on one arm of it. He felt better with her staying close, while Jason was squished on the couch with the others he'd be playing with. Babs and Dick sat on the other couch, talking to each other, and Bruce sat on the other armchair, watching everyone. Tim was content to simply sit and watch everyone play, and argue amongst themselves. He'd occasionally call out something, cheering on various people, but mostly kept to himself. The yelling wasn't really helping the anxiety he could still feel building behind his ribs, but he distracted himself by playing with Cass's fingers. She had offered her hand to keep him from picking at his skin, and he was grateful for it. If she hadn't, he was sure his fingers would end up a bloody mess before he was able to leave. Tim was startled out of his head by Dick clapping. "All right, Jason won. Duke, Damien, Steph, switch out with me, Cass, and Tim," he called. Tim opened his mouth to argue, but Steph was already shoving her Joy-Cons into his hands. "Have some fun, Tim," she encouraged, pulling him from his armchair. She maneuvered him onto the couch, shoving him down between Cass and Dick. Tim involuntarily stiffened before forcing himself to relax. He could sit between his older brother and sister for a few minutes. Usually, he'd be fine with the contact from Dick. But with how on edge he was, it was making his skin crawl to be pressed against him by the limited space on the couch. Cass had taken his armchair, while Duke and Damien sat with Babs. Tim shifted a little closer to Cass while everyone was picking their characters, trying to keep up with the banter as they argued over cups. And, for a bit, it was fine. He knew he was quieter than he'd usually be when playing video games, but everyone seemed too caught up with the game to say anything. It wasn't until the last course that things went wrong. Despite being distracted by his own mind, Tim was actually doing pretty well, in third place between Jason and Dick, when Dick suddenly leaned into his space, trying to block his view by practically laying on top of him. And Tim just couldn't. The pressure made him feel trapped, and he dropped his Joy-Cons and pushed Dick away, running from the room. He could hear the others yelling behind him, but ignored it, rushing to his old room. There may not be much in there anymore, but it still felt safer than the rest of the manor. He ducked into the room, quietly shutting the door behind himself, only vaguely aware of the fact that he was crying, and struggling to breathe through it. He tried pacing, but found his legs struggling to hold his weight, and dropped to the floor instead. He pressed himself against the bed, at an angle hidden from the door. Without thinking about it, his right hand snaked under his sleeve, nails raking against the inside of his left wrist while rocking slightly. His thoughts were both too fast and entirely blank. The occasional thought of someone coming after him, surfacing before being swept away again. He couldn't be freaking out just because his brother unexpectedly laid on him. Suddenly, hands grabbed his wrists, pulling his hand away from where he'd been scratching himself, and he pulled against them weakly, brain scrambling at the fact that someone had found him. Someone was touching him, before a voice registered. "Just me, Birdie." And Tim threw himself forward into Jason's lap, wrapping his arms around Jason's neck and legs around his waist. He felt Jason sigh before hugging him tightly. "I've got you," he murmured, one hand smoothing over Tim's back as he buried his face into Jason's neck and sobbed. Distantly, he was aware of the fact that he'd run in front of everyone, and Jason was the one to come after him. Jason rocked him slightly, continuing to murmur to him that it would be all right. After a few minutes, Tim calmed enough to pull himself from Jason's neck and look at him. "Sorry," he tried, but Jason cut him off. "Nothing to apologize for, Birdie," he said softly, pulling away a little more. "Let me take a look at that wrist." Tim pulled his left arm from Jason's shoulder, holding it between them. When his sleeve was rolled back, there was a shiny pink patch on his arm where he'd scratched himself raw, and Jason sighed, causing Tim to flinch slightly. "It's all right," Jason reassured him. "I'm not mad. But we've got to get this cleaned up, all right?" Tim nodded and pulled back again, standing on shaky legs. Jason stayed close on the short walk to the ensuite bathroom. And Tim was grateful for Alfred's insistence that every bathroom have a first aid kit. Tim sat on the toilet lid as Jason pulled it out, grabbing antibiotic ointment and a bandage. They were quiet as Jason washed the wound with the washcloth and the antibacterial soap on the counter. Then Jason asked, "What happened?" Tim tried to gather his thoughts, but his mouth wasn't really cooperating with him. Instead, he signed one-handedly. "Didn't sleep much. Bad day. Dick was too much." Jason huffed a little. "Dick? Too much? No way!" He joked, and Tim smiled a little. While he was still feeling shaky, and now had a headache thanks to the tears, he was starting to feel better, emotionally, if a little wrung out. "Where is everyone?" he signed, a little confused by the lack of hovering. Jason grinned at him, surprising him. "Cassie's holding them back," he said. Of course, Tim should have expected that. Cass had been helping him with meltdowns longer than Jason had. She knew how much it would have freaked him out to have everyone around him. "We told them a bit, but we didn't know how much you wanted them to know." Tim thought for a moment, and shrugged. "They should know already." He sighed. While Tim hadn't had meltdowns around them before, aside from with the aid of toxins, his autism diagnosis was in his medical file. It should have been fairly obvious what happened. Jason sighed again and pressed a gentle kiss to the bandage, before pulling Tim's sleeve over it, causing his chest to warm. "Didn't seem like they did," he told Tim, not looking him in the eye. Tim's head cocked, and he used his free hand to tilt Jason's head back towards him. Everyone was freaking out over your rushing out, and they were surprised Cass and I weren't. When we mentioned it happening before, and knowing how to handle it, they only seemed more confused. We didn't say much else about it, so I imagine they'll want to talk. Tim huffed and dropped his head onto Jason's shoulder. He really just wanted to go home and take a nap, not have to explain to the rest of the bats that they'd somehow missed the fact that he was autistic for 5 years. Jason pressed a kiss to the side of his head, making him smile a little before pulling back. "Did you drive?" he signed. Jason's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "I brought my bike," he said, voice lilting up a little at the end. and Tim smirked, pulling out his phone and angling it so Jason could see the screen. He texted Cass, "Jason and I are sneaking out. Give us 20 minutes, then you can tell everyone we left." A moment later, she sent him back a thumbs up, and he was up, heading back to his old room. Jason went towards the door, but Tim caught him by the hand and dragged him to the window. "You want to go out the window?" he asked, incredulously. Tim motioned for him to be quiet, then quickly signed, "I don't want to be seen," before shoving the window open. Tim had snuck out of the room a few times, climbing down the tree outside it. The branches weren't the most stable, but they would hold their weight. Jason watched him climb down, then mimicked his movements, albeit a little more slowly and cautiously. Once he reached the ground, Tim reached for his hand and dragged him back to the front of the house, where his bike sat in the driveway, the last to pull in. "Are you sure you want to ride, Birdie?" he asked, and Tim scowled at him. He held his hands up in surrender. All right. You're lucky I've got an extra helmet," he said, while grabbing it from the side seat, as though the extra helmet wasn't kept there almost exclusively for Tim. Tim put it on and climbed onto the bike behind Jason, wrapping his arm securely around Jason's waist. Jason patted his hands once before kicking off. Tim rested his head between Jason's shoulders, eyes shut. He knew he'd have a lot of questions to answer later, but for now he was going to go back to his apartment and take a nap with his boyfriend. There are no notes on this book. That's the lasagna. Hi, the lasagna's done. Steph was talking to Babs, while Duke, Damien, and Dick, the 3Ds, just the loudest motherfuckers known to man, are passing my window right at this moment. Dick. Fuck. Instead, she queased? Is that an wait, holy shit, is that an autism thing? Pulling him— No, don't pull him away from his armchair.